Okay, welcome to the fourth podcast in a series of a total of 5 podcasts that look at Nazi economic policy, 1933 to 39. In the previous podcasts, we've looked at Hitler's aims, and then in the second and third, we've dug deeper into that, looking at his short-term aims with the new plan of 1933 to 39 under Schacht, who you can see on the cover there. And then secondly, in the third podcast, we moved from 36 onwards and saw how Nazi Party became what we call radicalised. It became more focused on preparation for war under Hermann Goering with his 4-year plan. Now, these next 2 podcasts are going to focus on the impact of their plans on the German people, focusing in particular here on these areas, the German Labour Front and the standard of living, which is pretty much focusing on the working classes, the lower classes. And then in the final podcast, we'll look at the kind of higher levels of the social ladder, particularly the farmers and businesses, and how these plans impacted on them. Okay, so zooming in, basically, we are now looking at, in this podcast, we're going to look at the working classes, okay, the sort of like lower part of the social pyramid. Remember, with the social pyramid, which we have looked at in the previous revision session, effectively you've got just write WC there, working classes at the lower part of the pyramid. That's who we're focusing in on here, the lower part of the pyramid. Why the lower part of the pyramid? Because there were more of them, and at the bottom because effectively they had least power. So let's move on. So Hitler wanted to create jobs. Okay, so we've established that fact, but he didn't want the workers to have rights. So he may have given them jobs. Schacht's new plan successfully created jobs. As we know, it went down from unemployment went down from 6.1 million to literally about 300,000 by 1936, a third of a million. But depending on how you look at it, those figures were massaged, but nevertheless they did get jobs. But bottom line is, Hitler did not want them to have rights. When we say have rights, basically we mean things like decent working hours, particularly improved working hours, and secondly, decent pay. Why not? Because he wants to get as much out of the workers as possible, because the bottom line is he wants Germany to be rearmed so that in the end Germany can wage war for living space. If you're going to rearm Germany, then the profit of the factories needs to be poured into weapon production. The profit should not be poured into the pockets of the workers, in other words, their pay packets. Added to that, if the workers are paid too much money, then they will want to spend it, and the German businessmen who run the economy will be asking themselves, well, where's the money for me? Is it in making weapons, or should I actually be making consumer goods? Because there are all these people out there who want to spend money on consumer goods. Hitler doesn't want that to happen. So the bottom line is he didn't want to pay the workers much money. Now, the organisations that the workers had traditionally throughout the Weimar Republic before Hitler came to power to campaign for workers' rights were what we call the trade unions. Okay, it's a basic right in any democracy of workers to belong to a trade union. Of course, the main weapon of the trade union is to go on strike if they feel the workers are not being treated properly by the bosses, by their employers. So very, very quickly Hitler realised, look at the date here, he became Chancellor in January 1933. Literally within 4 months, the Nazis crushed the trade unions. Now, how did they do that? We covered that in a previous revision session, that was the one from Hitler turning his chancellorship into a dictatorship. But you may remember how on the 1st of May, the day before, Hitler announced a workers' holiday, It's classic carrot and stick here. He made the workers feel valued. They got a day's holiday, and then literally the next day, when they returned to work, the Nazis, the stormtroopers were sent into the trade union offices, and they arrested and put into concentration camps the trade union leaders. That was the stick. 4 days later, on the 6th of May, it is written there, yeah, on the 6th of May, again, Hitler returned to the carrot. He announced that the Nazis, in spite of everything that had just happened, that the Nazis did care for the workers, and he formed a Nazi trade union. So, in a sense, it left the workers confused. They had had their rights taken away from them, and then Hitler announced that the German Labour Front, which was a state-run Nazi organisation that replaced the trade unions, would look after workers' rights. In actual fact, it didn't. Okay, it was really an instrument to control the workers, but nevertheless, it put up a pretense that it was looking after the workers. It organised various schemes, which we will look at in a future revision session, that benefited the workers in some ways. For example, put swimming pools into factories, things like that. It gave them cheap package holidays. That was called Strength Through Joy, an organisation that was called Strength Through Joy. The bottom line is, it didn't pay the workers more money, and bottom line is the workers were forced to work longer hours, and increasingly as you move into the late 1930s, the rights of the workers were eroded. They got less and less. They were increasingly told they had to move, that they had no choice. They had to go, for example, to the border of France to build fortifications in preparation for the war. A defensive wall called the West Wall was being built, etc. So the German Labour Front basically set working hours which were long. It set wages which were low. It did encourage workers and employers to work together in harmony. Basically, you can see the picture there. The hands together. Bosses and workers should not be in conflict, as they had been before Hitler came to power. But the bottom line of it is Hitler always made decisions that benefited the bosses. The factories needed to be used for rearmament, and Hitler needed to keep the businessmen on his side and reward them if they did basically produce lots of weapons for him. And remember, that was the whole line of the 4-year plan. Persuade the businessmen to make weapons, not by threatening the businessmen, but by saying you will be rewarded if you do make weapons for us. So the workers were expected to work harder and longer hours for less pay. Their role, if you were a worker, your role was to strengthen Germany. Your personal happiness was secondary to your main role, which was to strengthen Germany. So under the German Workers' Front between 1933 and 1939, working hours went up by an average of 6 hours a week. Standard of living therefore declined under Nazi rule. Although wages did go up, the price of food went up at a greater rate. So overall, people were eating less in 1937 than they were in 1927, and you can see that these trends in the graph here. Yes, more people were working, there were more jobs, but the hours were longer and they had fewer rights. And in addition, because the economy was focused on preparing Germany for war, particularly from 1936 onwards, when Goering took control of the 4-year plan, there were less consumer goods for people to buy, because the economy was geared towards rearmament. So those are the key features. Here's the test. Just an added point. A lot of that information from this podcast and those slides you can use, of course, if you get a question on the new plan or if you get a question on the 4-year plan. Okay, so when you revise, I know you tend to revise from your notes and you write your answer from the notes on that section, but this particular section is part of those topics, the new plan and the 4-year plan. So if, for example, you're asked about how successful was the new plan or how successful was the 4-year plan, it's important that you bring this information from this particular podcast into your answer. And the same with the next podcast, which will be about the other social groups higher up in the pyramid, the farmers and the businessmen, and how they responded to the new plan and the 4-year plan. Anyway, there is just a few brief questions that we used in the revision session about the working classes. Before you go to the final slide, I would just pause this podcast, have a go at those questions, and then play the podcast through. The next slide gives you the answers. So there are the answers there. Remember to use the factual test sheets that I've given to you in the revision sessions, and which you can download from the folder in Frog. Remember, the technique is fold it along that vertical line so you can't see the answers. Put it on top of a blank sheet of paper and constantly test yourself to bring your knowledge up to speed. Okay, that's this one. The 5th podcast then will continue by looking at the farmers and the businesses. Thank you.